Right. Welcome, everyone, to another edition of Philosopher Meets Critic. This is an event series hosted by the University of Cologne and the Federal University of Bahia in Brazil. My name is Marvin Bacchus. I'm at the University of Cologne, and I'll be hosting the event today. I'm very excited to introduce you to our philosopher today, Mona Simion. Mona is professor of philosophy and director of the Cogito Epistemology Research Center at the University of Glasgow. She's written extensively on various topics in epistemology, philosophy of language, and moral and political philosophy. The topic today will be her new book, which came out last year, titled Resistance to Evidence, and it was published by Cambridge University Press. Our three critics who will be engaging with Mona's book, Julia Staffel, associate professor at the University of Colorado Boulder, Juan Comesaña, professor in the philosophy department at Rutgers, and Matt McGrath, professor of philosophy at Washington University in St. Louis. I look forward to the discussion today. And before we start, I want to thank everyone again for being here and for participating in this event. We're very excited to have you. And with that being said, I want to give it over to Mona and her introduction to her new book.
So first of all, thanks a lot, everybody, for all the work. Very, very humbling situation I find myself in, where I read your comments. It's been really great and thought-provoking and fun to think through them. I probably agree with most of them, but for the purposes of today, I'm going to have to pretend that I don't. So here we go. So the book was initially supposed to be just a book about evidence and about my conviction that we're going about analyzing evidence in the wrong way, in that if insofar as we think that the relation of having evidence has something to do with the inside of our skulls, we are bound to get data on the ground wrong when it comes to people resisting evidence, so not uptaking evidence that is easily available to them. So that was what the book was supposed to be about, and it was motivated by, on one hand, the observations on the ground, annoying things like climate change deniers and vaccine hesitancy data and cases of testimonial injustice and so on and so forth. So that was a big motivator. But another thing that motivated me a lot was just kind of the theoretical part of it, whereby it felt very strange to me that, I would disagree about many things in philosophy. Usually, somehow both internalists and externalists seem to have, for the most part, agreed on one thing, which is that the having relation for evidence is something that has to do with the inside of our skull. So that I found very funny. And I thought that for sure, if everybody agrees, something is going to be wrong. So that's kind of the theoretical motivation for the book. So what the thought of the book was first to just develop an account of what is going wrong in evidence resistance. And the book does that, and it accounts for it as an input level cognitive malfunction. But I guess the stuff that I'm most excited about is that it offers the tools to distinguish between what is proper evidence resistance, i.e. the bad stuff, and clever and justified evidence rejection in cases in which you've got defeaters or your source is not trustworthy and so on and so forth. So that's something that we want in epistemology, but also outside of epistemology, especially since in social psychology it's become extremely exciting and sexy these days to say that everybody is irrational. We all engage in motivated reasoning to incredible extents. No matter how, fancy the school that we went to might be, we believe that guns are bad because we are leftists, and we like to believe that guns are bad, not because we have any justification to believe it, just like on the other side of the political spectrum, people believe all kinds of crazy things. And this kind of general irrationality assumption in social psychology annoys me greatly. In that if you look at the experimental setup, that's the exact data that they don't account for is this exact difference between justified evidence rejection and epistemically problematic evidence resistance. So that's why I was excited about this result. So the book ended up doing many more things because I have this weird German Hegelian tendency to just try to systematize everything that's going on in my head. And it's a very sickly tendency, and that is very hard to keep everything together. And I think that some of your comments basically show that it's been hard to keep everything coherent and nice. Also, as Julia well taught us, it's not clear that coherence is even that valuable. So what the book ended up doing is it, more or less restates my favorite account of justified belief as belief generated by properly functioning cognitive capacities that have the function of generating knowledge. And then it integrates this view with view of evidence and defeat that can account for the problematic data in evidence resistance cases. And on this view, evidence consists of facts that one is in a position to know, and that increase one's evidential probability. And of course, defeaters do the opposite. And of course, a lot of action is in the notion of being in a position to know, because we don't want the notion that's too encompassing, because that gives us an overly inclusive view of evidence, as well as an overly demanding view of evidence that we shouldn't resist. So we want being in a position to know to be quite a restricted notion. So in my view, that has to do with having a cognitive capacity with the function of generating knowledge that can uptake the relevant proposition. And I distinguish, for my purposes, between being in a position to know and being in a position to come to know. I don't claim that these are mapping onto any sort of pre-theoretical notions, although they do for me, but it is what it is. Where being in a position to come to know has to do with things that are easily available, but not easily cognitively available. So are things that I can, with a bit of walking around or opening my eyes or focusing my attention, come to know, but they're not things that I'm in a position to know just by, uptaking the evidence and forming the belief. After that, I also have discussions of norms of inquiry, because I think that norms of inquiry and their breach thereof affect justification, so that the question that arises is, how about evidence that you're not in a position to know, but you should have been in such a position? If you had done your inquiry properly, you would have been. So I put forth also a functionalist view of what's going on here, as well as a functionalist view of proper suspension. And then I apply this view to a bunch of things that I think are somehow marginal, but nevertheless relevant. So one thing, for instance, that I talk about is epistemic dilemmas. And the reason why I talk about that is because, of course, if you're someone like me who thinks that there exist epistemic obligations, you also need to tell us a little bit about what's happening in cases of epistemic dilemmas, because all of a sudden you basically are in the same trouble, Juan might think, as the ethicist, in that obligations are easily going to lead you to dilemma cases. And I argue that they don't exist, actually, in spite of the fact that there are such things as epistemic obligations. Then I argue that skepticism as a view is just a case of evidence resistance, in the same way in which Williamson characterizes it as a type of malfunction. I follow suit in that respect. And then finally, I supplement the account of evidence resistance with an account of disinformation as content with the capacity to generate ignorance, which is nice and complementary to the account of evidence resistance, which I think is helpful because it can neatly explain cases of justified evidence rejection due to disinformation. So that's the book. So now I'm going to kind of zoom in on the more theoretically interesting part that all of my colleagues have focused on. So as I said, the main motivation for the book is my annoyance with the fact that the evidential having relation has been traditionally conceived as called internal by both internalists and externalists. For instance, evidence had is knowledge for Williamson. It is facts or propositions taken up via reliable cognitive capacities, according to Burge and Sosa and Sylvan. It's seemings by all kinds of versions of internalism. All of these things are, at least to some extent, in people's heads. Because, at least to some extent, they're in people's heads, the prediction in resistance cases in which not much is happening in people's heads is going to be that the subjects in question don't have the evidence that is present at the case. Of course, depending on the case, some views are going to predict that the subjects have it, and some views won't. But the point is that none of these views get all the cases right. And now the problem is, if you can't predict that the subjects don't have the relevant evidence, it becomes really hard to say what they're doing wrong and not believing as they should. So on my view, the way in which I think about things in general, kind of my general epistemological picture, is that the genetic knowledge is the epistemic function of our practice of inquiry and thereby of our cognitive capacities, and that what we should do when we're trying to figure out norms governing all kinds of moves in inquiry, such as beliefs, assertions, disagreements, reasonings, and so on and so forth, is to look at this function of inquiry and then see what norms drop out of it. Because in virtue of being moves in inquiry, all of these things are going to be aimed at generating knowledge, just like the general practice is. So from this kind of general normative picture, I get my preferred view of evidence and defeat, where I call the view evidence as knowledge indicators, and I unpack this indicator relationship as having to do with increasing evidential probability and the agent being in a position to know the relevant fact. So there's the having relation is the being in a position to know relation, and the evidential support relation is one of evidential probability increase. Importantly, the two relations are not independent on this view, in that there needs to be some sort of, how Matt calls it, appreciation relation of the evidential support relation for the having relation to obtain to begin with, and to some extent the other way around as well. We can go more into detail in the Q&A. But the important point to remember is that you can't have evidence that you don't appreciate as being evidence for the relevant P. You can be aware of the relevant facts, but you don't have it as evidence, as it were, if you don't appreciate in the relevant sense its evidential support relation. And the converse is true of defeaters, of course. On my view, they're going to be ignorance indicators, somewhat unsurprisingly. So on my view, a fact is going to be a defeater if you're in a position to know it, and it lowers your evidential probability, where again, the two relations are not independent. And then, of course, as I said, a lot of action is in what it is for someone to be in a position to know. First of all, note that giving an extremely precise account of what it is for someone to be in a position to know is tantamount to giving a very precise account of availability, and that is, a bit much to hope for. But that is not to say that we can't say anything about it. So in my view, you're going to have qualitative limitations to this availability, in that maybe a cognizer of your type with your kind of cognitive capacities can't process this type of information. In that way, it's qualitative. Right. So, for instance, my 3-year-old can't process, information about epistemology. That is the type of information that is not even able to process. And there are going to be quantitative limitations, which we all share, where we can't really take up infinite amounts of facts or process them at the same time or keep them in front of our minds at the same time. So there's going to be some quantitative limitation to being in a position to know, as well as environmental limitations having to do with the fact that we can't teleport ourselves to find out what our friends in Australia are doing. So these limitations are important to keep in mind, because they are the ones that are supposed to make it such that the account is not overly demanding, right? So if we take, an everyday notion of being in a position to know, you're definitely going to get an overly demanding account. But if you think about this technical notion and its limitations, the ambition is that the account is going to predict exactly what's right. And then what it is, again, for someone to be in a position to know is for them to have a cognitive capacity or a cognitive process with the function of generating knowledge that is able to, as it were, in the relevant sense, so with the relevant qualitative, quantitative, and environmental restrictions, easily uptake the fact in cognizers of a SS type. A few things that are important about the view. First, it's important to note that it's a restricted thought-implied scan. So what matters is not whether you can take up the fact. Maybe you're a sexist, so you can't take up women's testimony because we're sexist, but a cognizer of your variety can. That's why it's a restricted thought-implied scan. What matters is not your can, but the kind of can that a cognizer like you with your cognitive capacities instantiates. And then again, recall what I said, the distinction between being in a position to know and being in a position to come to know. I may well be in a position to come to know all kinds of things in my visual field right now, but I'm not by focusing my attention elsewhere, but I'm only in a position to know stuff that's lying straight in front of me within that limited quantitative set of things that I can take up at the same time. So then the thought is, very roughly, that functions generate norms. Our cognitive processes should work in the way in which they're reliably conducive to generating knowledge in normal conditions, and that not taking up facts that one is in a position to know, so evidence and defeaters, and that have evidential relevance, is basically failing to take up opportunities to enhance closeness to knowledge, i.e. to function fulfillment. So that's how the view predicts that resistance to evidence is an input level cognitive malfunction, in the same way in which for our lungs, not to take up easily available oxygen would be an input level biological malfunction. So in contrast to that, justified evidence rejection, for instance, due to presence of defeat and so on and so forth, does not exhibit this variety of cognitive malfunction. So the upshot, of course, is that we get all of these cases that we wanted right, people who deny well-established scientific claims without having the relevant defeaters, such as climate change deniers, vaccine hesitants, and testimonial injustice perpetrators, are evidence predicted as evidence resistant by this view, all else equal, so unless they have defeaters and so on and so forth, in that they're tokens of a type of cognizer that's equipped with the relevant cognitive processes that can easily uptake the relevant facts. So thereby they are in a position to know facts that raise or lower their evidential probability for the relevant propositions, but they fail to do so. They fail to take them up. Thereby their cognitive processes exhibit on this view input level malfunction, in that they fail to take up these opportunities to enhance closest to knowledge. There you go. That's all.
Well, yeah, thank you very much, Mona, for writing this really interesting book, and also for the concept project to put together these really nice online book symposia. I have sort of 3 different things I want to raise in relation to Mona's account. And the first question I want to ask is whether Mona has the right notion of evidence. So here, just for people to get some sense of like how this is presented in the book, here are some quotes from the book. So Mona says, for example, evidence consists of knowledge indicators which enhance closeness to knowledge by enhancing evidential probability. She also says a fact E is evidence for P, for S, if S is in a position to know E, and the probability of P given E is higher than the probability of P, where this means evidential probability. And she spells out what it means to be in a position to know in the following way. S is in a position to know a fact E if S has a cognitive capacity with the function of generating knowledge that can qualitatively, quantitatively, and environmentally easily uptake E in cognizers of S's type. So that gives us kind of the general idea of how this works. Now, the first problem I want to raise is that Mona says evidence kind of brings us closer to knowledge by raising evidential probability. But I think that evidence can actually raise evidential probability while leading us away from knowledge. And the case I want to use to illustrate this with is from a really great paper by Rouillet on the dogmatism puzzle, which is this case about the swimming pool. And I'm going to show you this in more detail on the next slide. So here's roughly how this case is supposed to go. Suppose your friend Phil, who is a swimming champion, sometimes goes swimming at the local pool, and you learn that he's going swimming today. Call that evidence E. Now, because he's such a good swimmer, you also know that Phil is not going to drown today. Call that not P. You know that. Now, suppose that learning E, that he's going to go swimming today at the local pool, doesn't change the fact that you know that he's not going to drown today, because the fact that he's going swimming today is just incredibly weak evidence that Phil is going to drown today, right? So your knowledge that he's not going to drown today survives learning that he's going swimming today at the local pool. But of course, the probability that he is going to drown today, given that he's going swimming today at the local pool is a little bit higher than just the unconditional probability that he's going to drown today, right? Because the fact that he is going swimming today makes it very slightly more likely that he's going to drown, even though it does not destroy your knowledge that he's not going to drown, right? So what happens here is that learning E increases the evidential probability that P, but it doesn't bring you any closer to knowing that P. Rather, because you already know that not P, right? It's not going to change that, right? And so if anything, what E does is it decreases your closeness to knowledge. So I think the relationship between evidential probability and knowledge is just a little bit more complicated than I think maybe Mona's account makes it out. A related problem, I think, is what happens, if we say what knowledge should get in this framework of evidential probability. So if you think that knowledge gets evidential probability 1, and I'm not sure if Mona wants to say that, maybe she doesn't, so it kind of depends, but it is something that some people say. Well, if we want to say that, right, then we have this problem that nothing can be evidence for something that I already know, right? Because suppose I already know that Phil won't drown today, and then I learn that he's not going swimming today, that would be extra evidence that he won't drown. But if my evidential probability that he won't drown today is already 1, right, then nothing can raise it. So learning that he's not going swimming today then would not raise my evidential probability that he's not going to drown. And so it wouldn't count as evidence, right? So this is kind of inherited from this confirmation measure that Mona uses, because she uses the difference measure of confirmation. And this is kind of a known problem with that measure. There are some other confirmation measures that we could adopt that are supposed to get around that. But in this case, like the combination of the difference measure of confirmation with saying knowledge has evidential probability 1 would generate this problem. The other thing I wanted to ask about is this claim that Mona makes, that she wants to reject the view that evidence can't justify unless it's in the head. And here I want to talk about the case of Professor Racist from her book, right? So Professor Racist doesn't even notice the Black students who raise their hands in class, because he automatically only pays attention to the white students. And because he never pays attention to the Black students, he believes that the Black students are not very active in class. And Mona wants to say that this is a case of evidence resistance, and Professor Racist's belief is unjustified because he ignores the evidence he has that the Black students are raising their hands. But I want to point to the following asymmetry. I think it seems intuitive to say that Professor Racist is not justified in his belief that the Black students are not very active in class. But it also seems equally intuitive to me that if Professor Racist started believing right now that the Black students are participating, his belief would be equally unjustified. And that's because for all he knows, they aren't, right? He couldn't tell you one way or the other at the moment because he hasn't paid any attention to them. But if he has the evidence, right? If he has the evidence that they're participating or trying to participate, which Mona claims he does, then we want to know, why can't he base any beliefs on it, right? So it seems to me that this is actually something the internalist gets right, because they can explain why Professor Racist can't yet come to believe in a justified way that the Black students are participating, right? Because he doesn't yet have the evidence that they are raising their hands. He actually needs to get that evidence first. Okay, now moving on to the second thing I want to ask about, and this is Mona's treatment of normative defeat. And I think what Mona wants to offer is a unified treatment of normative defeat as an epistemic failure, right? So the important parts here are the unified treatment, and that it's specifically an epistemic failure, not, for example, a moral failure. So here's a case that Mona talks about where, there's a doctor who doesn't read the journals they should be reading, and so doesn't know certain things about curing a certain disease, and it seems like there's somebody who's like failing to have evidence they should have had, which is a case of normative defeat. So Mona says, we can explain normative defeat as a breach of a constitutive norm sourced in the constitutive function of these social roles. Since our Dr. X is a practicing doctor, they occupy the social role of doctor. As a result, they violate an epistemic norm associated with proper functioning for this role when they fail to maintain an up-to-date understanding of their field. Further, then, the account of what counts as available evidence is informed by the corresponding constitutive epistemic oughts, right? If a doctor ought to know what's in a particular medical journal, then the content of that medical journal automatically counts as available evidence for the doctor. But what I'm worried about is how we extend this account to cases in which I don't have a particular role that comes with constitutive obligations. So here's an example that illustrates this kind of case. I promised to pick you up at the airport at a particular time, and I'm supposed to then drive you to an important job interview. And I believe that if I leave 30 minutes before the pickup time, I can make it on time. And I don't bother to check the traffic conditions. But if I had checked the traffic conditions, I would have seen that the freeway is blocked due to an accident, which means I have to make a lengthy detour. So, right, so in this case, I do not have the information that my trip is going to significantly be delayed to the airport, right? So I have a normative defeat case here because I should have checked the traffic, and it seems like my belief that I can make it to the airport in 30 minutes is not justified. Now, why does this seem hard to accommodate for Mona's account? Well, it seems that I don't have any particular social role that makes me responsible for knowing the traffic conditions, right? It's just because I promised to you to pick you up, for that reason, I should have known the traffic conditions. Now, certainly what we could do is postulate these like one-off roles that are generated by promises or other temporary obligations that we take on. But if we do that, it seems like, we sort of end up with a sort of proliferation of constitutive epistemic oughts that we might want to avoid. But another option for what we might say about this case is that this is just a case where there is a moral norm that has epistemic content. And Mona actually makes this distinction very compellingly herself in the book, where she says, look, just because a norm has something in it about knowledge or information or something, right, that doesn't make it an epistemic norm. There are sometimes moral norms that just, have some kind of epistemic stuff in them. And so, for example, Mona says that promise keeping is indeed a moral good. And accordingly, the norm might be something like this. The moral norm, if you promise that you will do A, you ought to take reasonable means to ensure that you're able to do A, including collecting the needed information, right? So in this case, then applied to our example, there would be kind of a moral failure that I'm exhibiting because I'm not checking the traffic, which would be useful and important for me to do so I can pick you up on time. But if that's right, then some instances of normative defeat are really primarily a moral failure rather than an epistemic failure. But of course, that doesn't fit very well with Mona's sort of ambition to have a unified treatment of normative defeat where we're always dealing with an epistemic failure in particular, not a moral failure. Okay, so then the last thing I wanted to talk about was Good's theorem about the value of evidence. So in the first half or so of the book, Mona goes through various possible ways of explaining why it's epistemically bad to resist evidence. But I thought that there was a particularly promising option that she leaves out. And this is appealing to Good's theorem about the value of evidence that is in his paper from 1967. And basically what Good's theorem says in kind of informal terms is that if an agent who's going to face a decision can acquire some additional cost-free information, they are well advised to do so. And this is because they can expect that updating on that information and deciding with their new credences will improve the outcome of their decision. Now, the standard interpretation of Good's theorem is that it concerns practical utility and practical decision-making. But as, for example, Richard Pettigrew has shown, we can also basically reinterpret the formalism and say the decision is actually which credences to adopt or which beliefs to adopt, and then the utility would be epistemic utility or accuracy. And in that case, we can sort of make an epistemic version of Good's theorem that tells us that we shouldn't ignore cost-free information. So to illustrate that, I want to give you a little informal example instead of walking you through the formal theorem. But here's sort of the idea of why this is the case, right? So suppose I want to make money by selling band t-shirts, and I can either sell shirts for AC/DC or for KISS, but right now I'm 50-50 on which band is more popular. So if the act I choose is to sell AC/DC shirts, I will make $5,000 in case AC/DC is more popular than KISS, but I'll only make $100 if KISS is more popular than AC/DC. But if I sell KISS shirts, right, I'm only going to make $100 if AC/DC is the more popular band, but I can make $5,000 if KISS is the more popular band, right? Makes sense. Now, at the moment, right, I'm 50-50 on which is the more popular band. So right now, the expected utility for each of these acts is that I make an expected $2,550. Now, it seems like it would be useful for me to actually learn which band is more popular, right? And Good's theorem sort of tells us in formal terms why that is, because, you know, if I learn which band is more popular, then I know which shirts to sell to make money, right? So, right, if I learn that AC/DC is more popular, I'll sell AC/DC shirts and make $5,000. If I learn that KISS is more popular, I'll sell KISS shirts, and then I make $5,000 selling KISS shirts, right? So either way, learning the information of which band is more popular is going to increase my expected utility, right? So I can expect to make $5,000 after I learn which band is more popular versus my expected profits are only $2,550 before, right? So that's kind of the structure of Good's theorem, which says, like, with more information, you can sort of make more tailored decisions to your situation, which is going to make you expectedly better off. That's kind of the idea. So of course, this is kind of a practical interpretation of this, but there is an epistemic version where we then have a theorem that says something like this: the agent will benefit from learning new information because an expectation, the accuracy of the updated credences will be higher than the accuracy of the agent's current less informed credences, right? So that means if we have an agent who resists evidence that is either cheap or cost-free, that agent would be epistemically irrational for making a choice that fails to maximize expected epistemic value, right? So this person is sort of leaving epistemic value on the table. Now, how would that apply to Mona's cases? Well, I think when we look at the cases that Mona talks about in the book, there are sort of three categories of cases. The first category is actually not covered by Good's theorem, but I think that's correct. And I think Mona sort of would probably agree with that, right? So there are cases in which the agent learns some new evidence and updates on it, but uses an epistemically bad updating rule, right? So basically, they just sort of, you know, make sort of like a bad inference from the evidence they have. So they use the evidence, but in a bad way. Like, for example, we have this guy, George, who always discounts testimony from women, right? So it's not like George is not really listening. He just thinks, you know, the evidence he gets from the women is kind of worthless. And so that means he's not really kind of taking it into proper consideration. So it's not like he's ignoring it necessarily, but, you know, he sort of treats it the same way as, you know, testimony from a sort of any sort of garbagey source. And it seems like that's a bad updating rule. And it seems like these other cases are kind of similar. Now, a second category are cases where an agent learns something but doesn't update on it and doesn't use the evidence. And I think this is a case where Good's theorem can be applied and show and used to show that the agent leaves epistemic utility on the table and that that's bad, right? So for example, we have a case in which Alice is looking at a table, but she fails to form the belief that there is a table, right? So it seems like she gets the evidence, but she's not using it. So we can show with Good's theorem that that's, bad, epistemically speaking. We have also a case where Dave can't bring himself to believe that his friend is the murderer, even though he has found conclusive evidence. Now, again, that's sort of a case where evidence is sort of acquired but not used. And again, Good's theorem can tell us that that's a bad idea. Now, the last category is a case where the agent doesn't learn E, but could have easily done so and updated on it. And again, that's a case where the agent leaves epistemic utility on the table when they shouldn't have done that. And I think that's actually a good way to account for certain normative defeat cases, like Professor Racist, right? Where Professor Racist could have very easily gotten the information that his Black students are trying to participate. And if he had gotten this information, he would have, gotten a very significant increase in the epistemic value of his beliefs, right? So, and that's kind of a nice way in which we can sort of subsume cases of normative defeat under this category that is covered by Good's theorem. Now, the questions arising then is, well, when we use this Good's theorem style explanation of what's wrong with evidence resistance, we're using some of the same ingredients as the view that Mona likes, right? We appeal to epistemic value and how agents should attain it, but it's a very minimalistic kind of explanation of, what's wrong with resisting evidence in these cases. So what I wonder is whether this story is actually compatible with Mona's story, or whether she thinks maybe there's something missing that we need to really, account for evidence resistance in the right way that this kind of minimalistic account cannot deliver. All right, so that's where I'll stop. And there we go. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, both Mona for the introduction to your book and Julia for the first comment. And now, Mona, you have some time to respond to Julia's comments.
Yeah, so I was just saying thanks so much for the incredible amount of work. This is really great. I'm very worried about some of the things that you pointed out. I should say that I'm mostly worried about the first thing, and it's a worry that I had for a while, and I kind of, cheekily avoided telling people what I mean by this distance to knowledge thing for a very long time, and it was high time that someone called me out, and I guess our specialist in distances should have been the person, so there you go. So I've been thinking about how to unpack. So I've been using this notion of distance to knowledge as a primitive, I guess, for the longest time. And for the longest time, I thought that I was even entitled to do so. And the reason for that is what I'm saying here on the slide under point 1, which is that I suspect that the full analysis of what distance to knowledge is not afforded by a knowledge first program, because if you fully analyze distance to knowledge, you end up analyzing knowledge, I think, right? Because you're basically telling us how to minimize it until it's gone. So you can't really do that unless you analyze knowledge eventually, right? But of course, it's still cheeky to say nothing about the notion. So thanks a lot for pressing me on this. So just to remind people, Julia worries a bit about how this distance to knowledge works, because it does seem as though, when we have defeaters to something that we know, that particular defeater is, if anything, taking us away from knowledge that we have, but it's also a piece of evidence at the same time, but it can't possibly take us closer to some other knowledge, because of course, if we know that P, clearly non-P is false, so it can't be that my defeater is getting me closer to knowledge that non-P, since non-P is false. So that is indeed why you can't unpack this distance in a kind of world-bound way in that way. So here are the thoughts that I had over the years about how to unpack this notion. I should say that it's getting more and more high stakes to unpack it lately because of this kind of work in knowledge first epistemology that I've been doing. So here are a couple of things that came to my mind. So clearly what I mean by closeness to knowledge, it has gonna have to be either a thing that's epistemic rather than objective. So either it's gonna mean something along the lines of the world where I know is getting closer, as far as I can tell, based on my evidence, right? So it is definitely not the case. Now that I have some evidence that my friend Phil is going to the swimming pool, is definitely not the case now that I am closer to knowledge that he's gonna die drowning, because it's false that he's gonna drown. I know that he's not gonna drown, and it's false that he's gonna drown. So it can't be that this piece of information is getting me closer to knowledge that he's gonna drown, since it's false. So it can't be, we can't unpack closeness in this kind of actual world-bound way. We also can't unpack it in a metaphysically close way. So the world where Philip drowns, it doesn't get closer, metaphysically, objectively, just because I acquired this piece of information that he's swimming today, right? But it does get closer epistemically, right? So based on my evidence, the world where he drowns has now just become a tiny bit closer. Not a lot, as you point out, but a tiny bit closer. So that's one way to think about it. The reason why I find this very intuitive, and indeed, when I hear distance, because I grew up with many modalists, that's what I hear. I hear where the world is, really. The worry that I have with that is that my view is already quite complicated. If we sprinkle a bit of modality on it as well, it's getting a bit annoying for my taste. I like simple things. So that's one way to go. Another way to go is to just stick with the program, as it were, and just say, well, in normal conditions. So to instead of saying it gets you closer to knowledge, to just say it gets you closer to knowledge in normal conditions, which is something that is plausible about evidence, right? And in co-authored work with Chris Kelp on the normativity of credence, we already make a claim like that basically the reason why our credences are supposed to track epistemic support, so evidential probability, is because in normal conditions, if you track epistemic support properly, you're going to get closer to knowledge. So that's a couple of things that I can say to unpack this notion. I guess I want to hear from Julia which one is the better one, since you're the specialist in distances. But yet clearly cannot be an objective notion because of misleading evidence, indeed. All right, next thing. Does knowledge have to have evidential probability 1? And if not, is it true that nothing can be evidence for something that you already know? So I've been annoying people for a very long time by avoiding to say what I think about this, because I wasn't sure what I think about this. I started off by finding it extremely implausible, based mostly on arguments brought forth by Jessica Brown. And now I'm starting to find it more and more plausible. I managed to argue myself into it. But I want to say that independently of that, I am quite comfortable with the claim that nothing can be evidence for something that I already know. And in particular, I am quite confident with the claim, which is independent of what I think about probability 1 and knowledge, that as soon as something is at probability 1, as soon as I am at probability 1, the next piece of thing that comes at me cannot be evidence anymore. So basically what I'm thinking about is, consider the following case. I'm now looking straight at my laptop in front of me, right? So say that Juan interrupts me now, and just to say, oh, Mona, just to point out, there's a laptop in front of you. So I don't think that his assertion would be further evidence for me that there's a laptop in front of me. Indeed, I think that it's perfectly permissible for me to reject his assertion, so to reject this piece of data that just isn't evidence for me by saying something like, oh, thanks a lot, Juan, for pointing the obvious, or for mansplaining my visual field to me. Thank you, Juan. So I think that suggests that it's absolutely fine that this is not evidence for me anymore. Now, of course, Juan's testimony is evidence for everybody else who is not at probability 1 or who doesn't know that there's a laptop in front of me. I'm not saying that his testimony is not evidence implicit, it's just not evidence for me because I'm already at 1 or because I already know, depending whether I think that the two are equivalent or not. So how about this asymmetry that Julia mentions? I should say that Matt McGrath makes a similar point, so I'm just going to answer to both of you now about Professor Racist, whereby I want to say that he's not justified to believe that the Black students are not active in class, but Julia points out, well, sure, but if you want to say that he has this evidence, shouldn't you be able to explain why is it that he's... Also, we want to say if he forms the belief that the Black students are quite active. That belief would also be unjustified. But why is that? How come this asymmetry arises? I want to say, look, there's an interesting thing to be thinking about there, what is going on. But I want to say that this particular thing doesn't lie very heavily on my shoulders, because we know that just basing your belief on evidence is not enough for justification. You need to do it in a proper way, right? So if I might know P and Q, and it might be true that P and Q support R inductively, but if I take them to support R deductively and form the belief that R as a result, I will not be justified in my belief that R, even though I have the evidence and the evidence does support R. So we already know that there's some proper formation condition that we need to have there. So the fact that this guy not only is not justified were he to believe, but also it looks as though he can't possibly be justified, can be explained by the fact that it's incapable to form properly given how the data obtains. But I think that we need to think a bit more about how that is the case. But I want to say it's not that big of an issue, the asymmetry. You would expect the asymmetry because this kind of lack of proper formation availability. Finally, how about, oh no, it's not finally, almost finally. Julia asks, how about normative defeat when there is no social role, for my view? So recall that the view that I had in the book, and that Matt McGrath will know I don't have anymore because of him, which is the story of my life. I should really stop talking to Matt, is the story in the book about normative defeat was that social roles always have constitutive norms, but some of these norms sometimes are epistemic in that they generate knowledge, and as soon as that happens, they generate normative defeat. That was roughly the story. So the story was that doctors the role is constituted by a bunch of norms, including epistemic norms that tell doctors to read up on the recent literature. It's an epistemic norm because it's knowledge conducive. When they fail to do so, it affects their justification by a normative defeat. So Julia is right that the reply to her case, the airport case, is going to have to be that there's some social role involved there. Now, do I worry about the proliferation of social roles because they might proliferate normative defeat? Not because they might proliferate normative defeat. I think that basically this is going to kind of just be too ad hoc. So I think that the worry is not one of proliferation as much as it is that whenever we have an intuition of normative defeat, I'm going to jump and say yes and find the social role to go with it. And I'm not a big fan of that, as it were. So that is a worry that I have. That being said, as I said, Matt has already convinced me that this way to think about normative defeat really doesn't work. And I think is one of these things that I just can't save anymore. And I need to humbly retreat. So Matt's case is the opposite direction of the biconditional. So I guess together with Julia's case now, it's completely killed. So Matt's case is one that regards Matt's social role as a man, which comes with an inbuilt norm to investigate sports-related stuff. And it is an epistemic norm by my lights because it is knowledge conducive. If he does investigate it, he's going to come to know stuff about sports. Nevertheless, it doesn't seem to defeat Matt's justification in any interesting way. So poor Matt, if he's not interested in sports and he believes that the Euro Cup final is on Thursday, even though in fact, unbeknownst to him, it has been moved to Monday, it seems perfectly fine. His belief seems perfectly justified. He doesn't seem to have these obligations to investigate. In spite of the presence of the social role. So in a nutshell, in a recent paper, in a volume that Juan and Matt are editing and where his comments made me give up the view, I have a revamped unified view, which I think Julia is going to like because it's unified like the good one, as it were, in that evidence availability is all that matters. And it relies on the observation that what matters when it comes to the good doctor is not that much that he is a doctor, as it is that in virtue of being a doctor, he has a bunch of available evidence about stuff. So in order to see this, consider if the doctor has evidence available to them that they have been developments in his field, which normal doctors do, but he doesn't bother to check these developments, then his relevant beliefs are defeated. So that's the Sandy Goldberg original case, right? But now consider an alternative where the doctor is trapped on an island and thereby has no evidence available to them that there have been developments in his field on the topic at hand. It looks as though in this case, his justification is no longer defeated, but the poor man is still a doctor. So the social role hasn't changed. So the availability of evidence has changed, right? So I want to say that actually it's been quite nice that Matt has forced me in a corner because I discovered that actually I can have a nicer, more unified view in a future book. How about the good way? So that's something that Richard Pettigrew and I have been talking about ever since he wrote that blog post that I think you're talking about. I don't think he has a paper yet. It's just still the blog post. Am I right, Julia, about the how to account for evidence resistance by the good theorem? Anyhow.
I think there have been several developments of the view. I'm not sure what the most current version is.
Yeah, because he kept changing the blog post, so I kept responding. So I don't know exactly what the view is anymore. But from from what I've seen and what I've thought about so far, is of course I'm not gonna like going pragmatic, and you're not surprised about that, and neither is Matt. And the reason why I'm not gonna like going pragmatic is because it's easy to generate cases in which I don't care about, it's not good for me to know this information, because I would prefer not to know it because it would produce pleasure in me not to know it, right? Or something like that. So for instance, if my political identity is such that it would harm me to find out that climate change is happening, because it wouldn't sit well with my right-wing tendencies or something like that, it would seem as though now the prediction is going to have to be that there's no defeat, no normative defeat for climate change deniers. So that seems like the wrong prediction in this case. And I talked to Richard about this, and he said, well, maybe the way to go here would be that we should just go for values that we should have had. And I think that that's something that doesn't satisfy me, because, of course, if we end up in a should, we haven't quite yet offered the reductive theory. And indeed, obviously I'm a knowledge first, or maybe I'm not a sucker for reductive theories, but still, we haven't explained exactly the normative notion that we were after, right? And how about going for the epistemic value? So to be honest, I don't know exactly how it will be unpacked, and I would like to see it fully unpacked, because I would be so happy if it worked. As you say, it's actually quite compatible with my view. A good picture with knowledge as the value is basically what I would want. So that would just mean that my view can be put in nice and precise formal terms. So I would love it if it happened. I do have some worries. Of course, I haven't seen it fully developed anywhere, but it seems to me as though there's some worries off the top of my head that I can think of. First of all, how to formulate it, because clearly you don't want to go super consequentialistic, because you know that it doesn't work, right? So the opportunity of getting more knowledge or more truth, we know that that doesn't affect one's justification from consequentialist fairist type cases, right? So in that way, the worry would be that the good theory, if we go in that way, would both overgenerate and undergenerate a defeat. It would ask us basically to take up all possible epistemic value left and right. On one hand, and if we don't do that, our stuff would be defeated, our beliefs would be defeated. And on the other hand, it might be that it also undergenerates, in that in cases in which the consequentialist fairies don't give us much, we're not affected by defeat. But that's, again, it might be that the view doesn't have these problems, but I don't know unless I see it. I guess the thing that I'm mostly worried about, that I think is going to be the hardest to do, is what the value is. Because it seems, think about a bit these resistant cognizers. So if you want to say the value is knowledge, which is what I would like to say, I worry that it's not going to work for lack of ability reasons. So basically, these people, you can't say, well, these people should take up this evidence because it's a knowledge opportunity that they're missing. For them, it's not a knowledge opportunity, because they're so racist that even if they come to believe that, there's not going to be knowledge, because of all the incoherence with the rest of their belief system, improper formation, and so on. So you basically need to clean up their racism first in order for them to be able to gain knowledge. So you have to go with truth. But if you go with truth, you have clairvoyance problems, right? So you can't say, well, they should take it up because it's true, and that it's a bit of a shame, all this epistemic value on the table. It doesn't seem like clairvoyants have any obligations to take up truth about the president. So that's kind of, the dilemma there, I think. But yeah, this has been fantastic. Thanks so much.
Okay. Thank you again, Julia and Mona, for the reply. The next commentator will be Juan Comesaña.
All right. Well, thank you, Mona, for having written such a rich and interesting book. And thank you also to the organizers at the Concept program for inviting me to comment on it. So the book, as I said, is very rich, and it's an elegant, functionalist, knowledge-first account of an overall epistemological theory that can deliver the verdicts that Mona wants for cases of evidence resistance. there's a lot of things in the book that I found very congenial and that I agree with, including, for instance, her distinctions as to different cases of evidence resistance and her distinction between evidence resistance proper versus justified evidence rejection, as one might put it. And there are many other things that I think are tightly argued, and the whole book is tightly argued. But in a way, it's coming from a completely opposite perspective from the one that I have. From our philosophical sensibilities are diametrically opposed, which doesn't mean that I don't understand where she's coming from. I think I do. But I want to, in these brief comments, just tell you how things look from the point of view of someone with my philosophical sensibilities. And for the purposes of our disagreement, I think let me explain briefly what my outlook is. My outlook is that evidence that you have places prohibitions on which doxastic attitudes you are unjustified in having. Right. So, of course, Mona and I are going to disagree about what it takes for a certain proposition to be part of the evidence that you have. In the comments, I'm going to talk my language. I'm sure that in her replies, Mona is going to talk in her language. But I do want to note one little thing at the beginning, which is this distinction that Mona makes between being in a position to know versus being in a position to come to know. Indicates that there is a little bit of a cinch in the armor that Mona constructs there, right? Because why do we need that distinction? Well, we need that distinction, of course, because evidence possession has to have some cognitive component, right? Facts that are not within your cognitive purview, both Mona and I would agree, don't really form part of your evidence. Where we disagree, I think, is what it takes for something to be within your cognitive purview. So Mona thinks that if it's easily available and it is it's a function, you have an evidential function that whose purpose is to take up that kind of evidence, then you should take it up, and therefore it is part of your evidence. I don't think so. So as I said, I'm going to talk in my language. Probably Mona in her replies is going to talk in her language. We could intertranslate, but it would make the discussion way more cumbersome. So I want to do two things. One is discuss a little bit one of the cases, which is the more interesting one, I think, and tell you how things look from my perspective. And the other one is to take up a very interesting argument that Mona proposes for why she thinks there are general theoretical reasons that we should accept the existence of epistemic obligations. So I said, I think there are epistemic prohibitions. I don't think there are epistemic obligations. So let me start with the case. So there's a bunch of cases that Mona gives. I'm not sure whether Mona wants to deny this or not. I don't think she needs to. There are a bunch of cases where the subjects are simply believing against evidence that they already have. So those are, of course, easily explainable from an evidentialist perspective, such as the one that I have. Or there are other cases which are cases of justified evidence resistance, as Mona rightly points out. And then there are those cases, like the case of perceptual non-responsiveness and the case of Professor Racist, that are the ones where maybe we would disagree. So take the case of Professor Racist. He has an unjustified belief that people of color are less intelligent than white people. And this unjustified belief directs his attention away from his Black students such that he doesn't even notice when they try to participate. So as a result, Professor Racist believes that Black students are not very active in his class, which is a false belief. And the question is whether this belief is justified or not. Mona thinks it is not. Sorry, the question is whether this belief is unjustified. So Mona thinks it's unjustified. I don't think it's unjustified. And as a corollary, Mona thinks that it's a problem for my view, which she explains how it entails that Professor Racist believes is not unjustified, that the belief is unjustified, and I don't think it's a problem. So as a little parenthetical aside, Mona attributes to me some kind of reliabilist picture, and whereas I was a reliabilist of some sort in my youth, I am not in the book that she is taking the view from. But I don't think that matters at all. I think the view has the same consequence that she rightly points out. It does, so it doesn't depend on that. So there's a lot of things to say about Professor Racist, starting with the fact that he's a racist. To my mind, that doesn't mean that his belief is unjustified. And in fact, to claim that his belief is unjustified is to take away from the tragedy of the situation a little bit. It's analogous to, saying, changing Oedipus's story so that he was justified in believing that he was killing his father and marrying his mother. That changes the story from an interesting tragedy to a boring sociopathic tale. Mona claims that the fact that Professor Racist's case has moral undertones is irrelevant. I don't think so. I think that it is doing something, the fact that it has moral undertones. Of course, some people think that that is perfectly okay, that we should test our epistemic theories in tandem with our moral theories. Not Mona, as far as I understand. She says, no, it's irrelevant whether the case has moral undertones or not. I disagree. I think that if we sanitize the case so that it has no moral undertones, what we are left with is somebody who has evidence that he could have easily picked up but didn't. And then if you have my sensibilities, you're going to say, well, then he's justified in believing whatever the evidence that he did in fact take up justifies him in believing. Whether he had moral obligations to take up some other evidence is a different matter. So one other small thing, but I'm going to pass on that. Let me tackle this question directly of whether we have epistemic obligations or not. So Mona says that the traditional picture is one where epistemology is about permissions and not obligations. So if you have certain evidence, you are permitted to form the belief that P. I sort of agree with that, except that I think that a more fruitful way of thinking about it is in terms of prohibitions rather than permissions, right? So if you have evidence E, then that evidence justifies a certain doxastic attitude. And that means that you are epistemically prohibited from forming any other doxastic attitude. Right? If you're a permissivist, you're going to think it justifies a number, not just one, but more than one epistemic attitude. But then you are unjustified. You're prohibited from forming any other attitude that's not justified by that. That's the way I think of epistemic oughts, so to speak, as prohibitions rather than obligations or permissions. So Mona thinks that there are epistemic obligations, and she gives an interesting argument, which I'm going to share with you right now, which is this one. And the gist of the argument is that when you take a look at the way that epistemic defeaters work, you realize that epistemic defeaters obligate you. And of course, if epistemic defeaters obligate you, then evidence itself, because it's in competition with epistemic defeaters, should obligate you as well, right? And so the argument goes like this: defeaters affect what one is justified to believe. And if defeaters affect what one is justified to believe, then it is epistemically impermissible to fail to adjust one's doxastic attitudes in light of defeaters. So spoiler alert, this is the premise that I think is crucial, and I think it's ambiguous in an important way. And in one disambiguation, it's false, and in another disambiguation, it's true, but doesn't give Mona what she needs. So all the rest is sort of not very central. So, if it's epistemically impermissible to fail to adjust your doxastic attitudes in light of defeaters, if one or two are true, then defeaters constitute an epistemic obligation. So 5 follows: defeat can be partial defeat. If defeat can be partial defeat, then justifiers carry normative weight against defeaters. You can weigh them against each other. So, and if they do, then epistemic permissions cannot carry weight against epistemic obligations, so therefore epistemic justifiers constitute epistemic obligations as well. So what I think about this is that Mona, I mean, I would even put it more radically than Mona does, which is that there's really no distinction between defeaters and pieces of evidence. They're all bits of evidence, right? So they move you one way or the other, but we shouldn't be thinking of defeaters as some special sauce that does something different than evidence. So I sort of agree and maybe even go beyond what Mona is saying here. So I think if Mona gets to 5, then the game is over for my kind of view. So I don't think she gets to 5 because I think that defeaters, like other bits of evidence, prohibit you from forming certain doxastic attitudes. So if you start out justified in believing that P, and then you acquire a defeater, you are no longer justified in believing that P because you're prohibited from believing that P. But the mere acquisition of a defeater is not going to obligate you to form a particular doxastic attitude. If you have a justification for believing that P, but you don't form a belief one way or another with respect to P, and then you acquire a defeater, and again, you don't form any attitude with respect to P either way, then you're fine as far as I'm concerned, right? You are not unjustified because justification pertains to in situ doxastic attitudes that you take, right? And so you're not taking any doxastic attitude. Acquiring a defeater, doesn't matter how many defeaters you acquire, doesn't force you to take any doxastic attitude, in the same way that doesn't matter how much evidence you acquire, it doesn't force you to take any doxastic attitude. Okay? So I think 2 is ambiguous, as I say. So if defeaters affect what one is justified to believe, then it is epistemically impermissible to fail to adjust one's doxastic attitudes in light of defeaters. The true disambiguation is the one that I said before. If you already believe that P on the basis of some evidence and acquires a defeater that makes you unjustified, then you are prohibited from continuing to hold that doxastic attitude, continuing to believe that P. But it is false that if you acquire a defeater, that can give you an obligation to form a doxastic attitude that you haven't yet formed, right? Again, take the case where I have some evidence E that justifies me in believing that P, but instead of believing that P, I go take a nap. And then I acquire a defeater that makes me unjustified in believing that P together with E, and I go take another nap because I'm super tired or whatever. I don't think I have done anything wrong. And so that disambiguation of premise 2 is false. So I think Mona is absolutely right. And I think if you can get to 5, then you have really an account on which there are epistemic obligations. But in order to get to 5, you need the wrong disambiguation of 2. So I don't think you get there. But once again, thanks, Mona, and thanks the concept organizers for this opportunity to talk about such an interesting book.
Yes, thanks a lot. Can you hear me? Yes. Thanks a lot, Juan. This has been super helpful. And as you well say, it is quite funny how we ended up in quite opposite, bits of the land, given that when I met you, we were both reliabilists, which is why I guess it was really hard for me to even understand that the reliabilist was no longer part of the view. I kept thinking that, the new view of evidence is still somehow building on the old indicator reliabilism. But yeah, so going back, I think that we agree on many things, actually. I mean, as I said, I think when I met you last time, among the views that I'm looking at that are trying basically to accommodate the cases, yours is getting the most cases right, indeed. So the exception of the perceptual non-responsiveness and the professor racist, the view doesn't have trouble with the other cases, which I also think is theoretically interesting, because if we end up in a view where this kind of paradigmatically externalist cases are getting a better kind of deal with internalist than they are with internalist positions such as, K equals J or something like that. That's also an interesting result, right? So traditional evidentialism is going to deal better with most of the resistance cases than, more recent externalism about evidence. And that's because basically the internal condition that evidentialists usually have is something like seemings, which is of course a much weaker condition than if you think that evidence needs to be believed, right? So of course, if it's a weaker condition, you're going to get more cases right. But now going back to what Juan was saying, so Juan wants to say, look, we want to keep with the moral explanation in the Professor Race's case. First of all, because it's an available explanation, so why bother to build it into our epistemology? But secondly, because he thinks that it would be a tragedy to focus on the epistemology in Professor Race's case, given how much of a moral tragedy it is what's happening in Professor Race's case. And he's thinking, well, analogously, changing Oedipus's story into one of lack of epistemic justification would transform it from a tragedy into the story of a psychopath. So I found that quite a cool way to put it. Now, of course, we all remember Oedipus, and I'm thinking that maybe the analogy is not as strict as Juan wanted it, because my thinking is, well, from what I remember, as the story goes, there's no way for Oedipus to know. He's not in a position to know by any account of being in a position to know that he's marrying his mother. And now if we imagine a variation of Oedipus where that's equivalent to my resistance cases, where his mom is desperately shouting repeatedly, Oedipus is me, your mom. And Oedipus continues, in the marriage process unperturbed, say because he's blinded by desire or something like that. We want to say that maybe Oedipus is a psychopath rather than, and that this is the story of a psychopath rather than a tragedy. And I take the resistance cases to be more like this. But on a more serious note, I think that the reason why I don't like the moral explanation is because I think it's not enough on one hand, and on the other hand, because I think it's not available to us. So why do I think it's not enough? Well, I think that it suffers on grounds of extensional adequacy, in that you're right. In order to test how to do this, you and I agree, we need to clean up the case of moral stuff and see if our intuition survives. And I want to say yes, and not only does it survive in kind of dull, more non-moral cases, but it even survives in cases of moral success. So imagine a case in which, because the butler is my friend, I can't hear what the police is saying. Whenever the police is trying to convince me that he murdered the victim, I can't even bother to listen. So this is exactly the case of Professor Racist, only it's a case of moral success. At least it is assumed in most of moral philosophy. It's a good thing to refuse to believe that your friends are murderers, or at least to give them a benefit of a doubt, and so on and so forth. So I guess what I'm saying is it's easy to construct cases of moral success, in which case the question that arises is, well, if it's a moral success, what's the problem? Because there still seems to be a problem. Now, leaving extensional adequacy aside, because I'm sure that Juan and I can disagree until tomorrow morning about the intuitions in this case, my worry is, I also have a more serious theoretical worry, which is one of prior plausibility. So my thinking has always been that any view that predicts the following conjunction, the conjunction of moral blameworthiness and epistemic perfection, is a false view. And the reason for that is because we know that there is such a thing as an epistemic condition on blame, right? So according to the epistemic condition of blame, very roughly, people disagree about how to formulate it, but everybody would agree with this extreme rough formulation. If I did everything right epistemically, and I still ended up believing that fying is the right course of action and thereby fied, when in fact it isn't the right course of action, it's in breach of the moral norms, I'm blameless for that norm violation. So this kind of epistemic condition on blamelessness can be turned on its head for blameworthiness as well, right? So what follows from this, it seems to me, is that you can't really be morally blameworthy if you did everything right epistemically, since if you did everything right epistemically, all else absent, you're blameless. So all else absent, if you are blameworthy morally, it follows that you also screwed up epistemically. Now, we have a strong intuition of moral blameworthiness in the case of Professor Racist. So it seems to follow that Professor Racist also did something epistemically wrong. Otherwise, we wouldn't have the blameworthiness intuition. I guess one thing that can be done is to withdraw and say, no, actually, Professor Racist is not morally blameworthy. He's just in breach of a moral norm, but blamelessly so. And I think that that is, I'm not comfortable with going that far in the defense of Professor Racist. I think that we need to at least get moral blameworthiness off the ground. And I think that that would be a tragedy if we end up with a view where Professor Racist is blameless morally and justified epistemically. He's just in breach of a moral norm. I think that's a bit giving Professor Racist a bit too much. How about this cool thing that Juan did to me with this argument? So I should say that Matt McGrath also gave me an objection to this argument in a conference, and I don't remember it. And I've been stressed all along that I forgot the objection. So Matt, if you happen to remember it as we have this conversation, please write it down. It's too late, of course. The book is published, but but going back, so this is a very cool objection that I didn't get in the past. So remember that what Juan said was that he thinks that all I need is 5. Because, and I agree with him, defeaters are just evidence against in their particular case, but they're evidence, right? So insofar as I get 5 off the ground, Juan thinks, then I should be fine. I don't need the rest of it. And I want to say, well, I need the rest of it, Juan, exactly for the reasons that you pointed out. So let me run you through it. So Juan doesn't like premise 2. He thinks that it's ambiguous. He thinks that what I'm doing here is I'm pointing out that defeaters have this kind of normative strength, but their normative strength is not one that gives me obligation to believe, right? So let's see what Juan replaces my premise 2 with. So remember, my premise 2 says, just a second, let me just move the Zoom thing. If defeaters affect what one is justified to believe, then it is epistemically impermissible to fail to adjust one's doxastic attitudes in light of defeaters. So Juan doesn't like this because he thinks it needs disambiguating. This, in order for me to get 5 out of it, I need it to be that defeaters somehow obligate me to believe something, but they don't. They just prohibit me from believing something, and he thinks that's not enough for me to get the argument off the ground. So, of course, as one would expect, what I'm going to do next is tell me that it is enough for me to get the argument off the ground. And indeed, I think I get it quicker with your reformulated premise, and I'm wondering what you think. So here is the reformulated way to go to 5. And then the former 5 is the current 3. And then from 5 onwards, we can go back to that slide and see how it goes. So here is the reformulated premise by Juan. If you have a justified attitude D towards P and then acquire a defeater which no longer makes you justified in having D towards P, then continuing to have D towards P is epistemically impermissible. So this is Juan's formulation. Here is how you get further with it. If it is epistemically impermissible to continue to have D towards P due to normative consideration X, then it is obligatory to stop having D towards P due to X. So this is just, the square of oppositions for deontic logic. Impermissible and obligatory are contrary, so you can always get an obligation from an impermissibility. Now, of course, Juan is right that this obligation is not the one that I'm after. So I'm after an obligation to believe, not an obligation to not believe, right? But now I already got the result that defeaters constitute epistemic obligations. It's just that probably Juan would say, yes, yeah, sure it did, but not the right kind of obligation. You want obligations to believe, not obligations not to believe, which are just prohibitions, right? Yes, but now if we add the rest of the argument, that's going to follow, right? So it's true, Juan is right that premise 3 here, which used to be 5, is only telling us that defeaters constitute obligations. It doesn't yet tell us that they're obligations to believe. They may well be obligations to not believe, right? And indeed, that's basically what the argument supports so far. But if we go back to the full argument, so notice that now I have premise 5, right? I obtained it from Juan's disambiguation. If I go further, unless there's a problem with the argument further, I get to 11. So the way in which I get there is by saying very roughly, I'm not going to bore you by reading it, very roughly, defeaters are obligations not to believe, basically prohibitions. Justifiers can be weighed against them and can defeat their power, as it were, their normative power, which seems to suggest that justifiers are also obligations, because otherwise they wouldn't be able to fight off defeaters, right? If justifiers are able to fight off defeaters on the normative scale, it follows that they're obligations as well, because mere permissions can't fight off obligations. So if justifiers are obligations, they are going to be obligations to believe, not obligations not to believe, in virtue of the fact that they're justifiers rather than defeaters. So that's why I need the rest of the argument. I hope I was clear. I got overly excited about this opportunity to reformulate the argument, so I'm not sure how clear I managed to be. But yeah, thanks so much. This has been so helpful.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be part of this session, and thank you, Mona, for writing such a splendid book. I learned so much. I don't agree with all of it, but the basic approach, there's something I certainly agree with. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. Okay. There we go. Okay, so my plan is going to be to first discuss what I think is a very important insight in the book, and then to give several critical remarks. In general, they will be, first, is there a unified phenomenon here? When we look at the examples, is there one sort of thing happening? Or I'm going to suggest there's two. And second, can the notion of being positioned to know do the jobs that Mona needs it to do? And I'm going to raise some questions about that. So let me start with this passage from Connie and Feldman. So a criminal investigator can know a proposition F, that the fingerprints at the scene of a crime have certain characteristics X, Y, Z. This can be strong, even decisive scientific evidence for the proposition that L, Lefty, was at the scene of the crime. But if the investigator does not know, or at least have reason to believe, that F indicates Lefty's presence, then the investigator has no reason at all to believe L, and so is not justified at all in believing L. To be justified in this case, he must in some way grasp the connection between F and L. The investigator must be informed of some indicator connection between this evidence and the conclusion that he draws in order for the evidence to have any impact for him. So there's a number of things going on in this passage, but here's a condition on justification that I find in the passage. I'm going to call it the appreciation condition. For a piece of your evidence E to justify you in believing that P, or for it to give you a reason to believe P, you must appreciate the connection between that evidence and P. And now this must take the form of knowing or justifiably believing that E supports P, or in some way grasping the support that E provides to P. I mean, and this can sound very intuitive. I myself believe this for quite a bit of time. Mona has cases in which, and I won't read the cases here, in which people do have evidence. That evidence does support a certain proposition, and it seems that they're justified, and yet they don't appreciate it. They don't grasp the connection. So this makes me think that they're just are counterexamples to this appreciation conditions. People can have good reason to believe a proposition and be justified in believing it, even though they do not meet the appreciation condition. They may have to have the ability to appreciate, that might be what we need, but they don't actually grasp the connection. They don't know, they don't see the connection. So I think that's a very important point, and it shows that I think that a common assumption made by Connie and Feldman and others is incorrect. This gives us a problem. So if we give up the appreciation condition, how do we handle the Lefty case and other cases like it, while also getting unwarranted optimism, one of her cases, and friendly detective right? So these are cases in which people have evidence, it supports a proposition, but they don't grasp the support, they don't appreciate it. And yet they're justified. Putting it differently, we need something to plug the gap between having supportive evidence and being justified.
but appreciation of support, even if sufficient, isn't necessary to plug that gap. Right? You can be justified because you have supportive evidence without appreciating the support. So right, maybe it's enough, but it's not required. What is required? Oops, sorry. Mona's approach is to appeal to an appropriate notion of being positioned to know, plus standard notions of evidential support and defeat. But she wants more than just to secure the right results about who's got which reason to believe what or who's justified in believing what. She wants to get epistemic oughts or shoulds out of this. She wants to appeal to these notions, being positioned to know, evidential support and defeat, to argue for conclusions about what we should believe. Okay, so now having complimented Mona, I want to turn to some possible problems. So first criticism, is there a unified phenomenon here? And here I'm duplicating, I think, what Juan and Julia have said to some extent. So in some of her resistance cases, the subject seems to possess the information in question. They know it, believe it, or somehow register it. In others, the information is easily available, but they haven't availed themselves of it intuitively. They don't possess it. So misdirected attention is like this, and so is political negligence. So just on political negligence, that's the case in which someone believes a certain person is a good president, but they had all this available evidence from mainstream media that they didn't take up. And there, it's not as if they wouldn't have to move their eyes at all. It's rather that they'd have to actually do a little something, I take it, in order to possess this evidence. I agree there's a problem in all of these cases, but I'm just concerned that it's not the same kind of problem. So is there a single sort of epistemic failure in these cases? Here's a worry about saying yes, and this, I think this is the one that, yes, this is similar to one of Julia's concerns. We seem to give evidence one lacks, but should have had more than a defeating role if we say yes. It can make one justified. So maybe Professor Race's belief that only the white students have their hands up is defeated, but it's a further step to think that he's justified in thinking, say, that John, one of the black students, has his hand up. And this goes for political negligence as well. So I'm concerned about that. Second, and it would take some time to develop this fully, but I'll try to explain it. I think there can also be evidence a person should not have possessed, and that such shoulds can come from norms, say, associated with being a good professor. Maybe there's certain things a good professor should not know, a good juror should not know. Maybe there's certain information they should not have, a good doctor perhaps. Maybe a good inquirer should not know what something if they know it to be misleading on the thing they're inquiring into, right? So maybe there could be should not have knowns as well as should have knowns. And then I worry that if I know something I should not have known, that's got to be epistemically okay, I would think. I would think if you know something, it's epistemically okay to believe it. And so I'm worried that once we allow evidence one should have had to make an epistemic difference positively, or really at all, to tell you the truth, then we're down the road to thinking evidence one should not have had can make an epistemic difference so that you can know something but not be justified in believing it. I'm worried about that. Okay, what about the lungs analogy? I won't read all this, but it's an interesting thought that the lungs have two jobs to do: obtain, go out and get the oxygen and then process it in the right sort of way. I don't want to fuss too much about the analogy. I would think that diaphragm and trachea have a role of getting the relevant air and oxygen to the lungs, and so it's not a failure of the lungs if the diaphragm stops working. Not to worry too much about that. I grant that there can be, in principle, organs that have the job of going out and getting something as well as processing it in the right kind of way. What I'm concerned with is the idea those are just two functions, and one could do well with respect to one and not with respect to the other. And we need to distinguish them, and they may not both be epistemic in character, purely epistemic. Now, criticism 2, asking too much of being positioned to know. So here's a very quick summary of Mona's general picture. The function of cognitive systems is to generate knowledge. So cognitive systems should proceed in ways that likely will fulfill this function under normal conditions. Thus, we can normatively assess cognitive systems' performances and omissions by reference to their contribution, direct or indirect, toward fulfillment of that function. Part of generating knowledge is getting and processing the right inputs. Those two things are part of it. And so this can give rise to cases of epistemic obligation. You should have got the evidence and process it, and then therefore you should believe, you ought to believe. That's very quick account of that view. So when ought a subject S believe P for Mona? Her answer, I think, is when there's sufficient and undefeated evidence for that subject supporting P. And when is there such evidence? And the answer roughly is when the subject is positioned to know some fact that sufficiently supports P for that subject and which is undefeated. Putting these together, we have what I'm calling PED, positive epistemic duties. If a subject is positioned to know a fact and that fact supports P for that subject and the support is undefeated for the subject, then the subject ought to believe it. So that's what I'm concerned about. Is it's very demanding. It seems to predict a lot of positive epistemic duties. But Mona thinks that her notion of being positioned to know can help us here. It reins things in. So it gives us a Goldilocks sort of position. You get enough epistemic duties to account for the relevant cases she begins with, but not too many. So the notion of being positioned to know is specified in this BPK. S is in a position to know a fact E if S has a cognitive capacity with the function of generating knowledge that can qualitatively, quantitatively, and environmentally easily uptake E in cognizers of S's type. And she glosses this sometimes with E is at hand for S in the internal and external environment. So the notion of being at hand is supposed to give us some kind of grip on what it is to be in a position to know. And these qualifications, qualitatively, quantitatively, environmentally, easily uptake, are supposed to help us avoid too many epistemic duties. But nonetheless, I'm concerned of an explosion, so to speak, of epistemic duties. So here's another nap case. Juan mentioned a couple of naps. Upon regaining consciousness from a nap, it looks like I'm positioned to know, by Mona's account, a gazillion things. From perception, from background knowledge. It's all these things I know. I can put them together to know other things. And these, if you think perception provides us evidence or makes evidence available in her sense, then it looks like there's just so many things I could know. And I haven't been working hard yet, so it's not like I'm taxed already. It looks like for each individual thing, I'm in a position to know it. For Mona, it's not true that I ought to believe all of these things, because that's too demanding. That is, it's not true that I ought to be such that I have an enormous number of beliefs, but it does look like for each one of them, I ought to believe it, right? So I do have an explosion of individual positive epistemic duties, even though I don't have a massive general duty that is to believe some huge conjunction or set of beliefs. Okay, so my second worry is what's wrong with zoning out. I'll just be really quick here. It just seems in some cases it can be completely okay if I have no professional or prudential or moral duties at the moment. It's okay to zone out and then so not uptake all this possible evidence that's available to me. This just seems epistemically okay, but I don't think it is for Mona. So maybe she can say something about that. I might be missing something there. And I'm also worried that the account of being positioned to know delivers some questionable verdicts. Here, it might matter whether we're trying to capture an intuitive notion or proposing a technical notion. So it could be that it's mainly a technical notion she's getting at. While counting the windows on the Chrysler building, it seems one is positioned to know a lot of irrelevant things, like the colors of hats of passerbys. That's important to what Mona wants to say, that actually if I'm counting those windows, then I don't have these epistemic duties to take up this evidence from perception and so forth. So I'm not in a position to know these things. However, it seems that I have to try hard not to take these things in. And this suggests that the information is easily taken up in a certain sense. It's at hand, to use a term Mona uses to explain this notion of being positioned to know. So I'm worried that on her account, actually, we don't get the results she wants, that even when I'm pursuing this inquiry about how many windows there are, it does look like I'm positioned to know all these individual things about the colors of hats and so forth. And then, it looks as if I could have positive epistemic duties there. So I'm just concerned about that. My overall point with these worries is maybe it's better not to distort the notion of being positioned to know to get the right results about epistemic oughts through PED. Maybe we should instead weaken PED. So PED, again, in essence said, if you're positioned to know some fact which supports some proposition, and that's not defeated for you, then you ought to believe it. But maybe we need to weaken that. Just very quickly, this is not an especially important point, but Mona's account implies that whether I epistemically should believe some proposition, say about the color of passerbys' hats, is affected by whether I'm taking up some effortful inquiry into some other matter entirely, perhaps. One might think that this is a kind of encroachment. It's not maybe pragmatic, it's not moral encroachment, but here's something that doesn't bear on the probability of my getting the thing right, on what evidence I have or how well positioned I am epistemically, but does for Mona bear on whether I should believe the relevant proposition. I don't have a problem with that, but I'm just noting that that does seem to be a consequence of the view. And Mona typically does have, in her past work, she's had worries about allowing features that don't bear on epistemic position to matter to what we are justified in believing or what we should believe. Very quickly, I'm just going to suggest an alternative approach to evidence resistance cases. So I think we should divide up the cases. There's those in which the person epistemically should believe something because of the evidence they have, versus those in which the person, in not some purely evidence, in some sort of not purely epistemic sense, should believe something because they should have had different evidence. For the former cases, and that's just what I'm going to focus on here, cases in which a person should believe something because of the evidence they had, I would suggest explaining the obligation as arising either from the fact that the person already has a belief and has counter evidence to it that they are positioned to take account of by following their evidence to give up that belief. And I should add, in following that evidence, forming other beliefs, right? It may be that in order to follow your evidence, you have to put 2 and 2 together, and that requires other beliefs. So since you should follow your evidence, you should form those beliefs along the way. Or from the fact that the subject is inquiring into whether P and has evidence for P that they're well positioned to take up by following their evidence to forming a belief that P. So the first is very similar, I think, to what Mona has in mind with her argument concerning defeaters. But my thought is that it really matters that you do have a belief, and you need to follow your evidence when you get counter evidence, if you can. And part of doing that can be forming new beliefs. And so I think that's a different idea that's in, it's not that far away. But, and the second is I'm inquiring into something and I have evidence and I'm well positioned to take up that evidence because of my abilities and so on, then I ought to do so. But it's not true that I ought to be believing everything I'm positioned to know. So the key thought here is that when your cognitive system is engaged on a question, either by having an opinion on it already or by inquiring into it, then one is on the hook for following one's evidence on that question, so long as one's well positioned to do so. And following that evidence can involve forming new beliefs. So I don't think that's so very far from Mona's proposals, but I, in effect, suggesting that it does matter that we're engaged on a question, We can't simply start with the thought that I'm in a position to know something and get into epistemic obligation now. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Can you hear me? Yes. Yep. Okay, perfect. Yeah, thanks a lot, Matt. Some of these things we've talked about for such a long time. I don't even remember which of these things we already discussed and which we haven't, basically. So if I'm going to repeat things that I've told you in the past, I'm really sorry. So here are a couple of things. Obviously, there's there's a lot going on, so I'm not sure that I'm going to have time to address everything, but here it goes. So Matt thinks that what the insight that transpires from the cases and the discussion around them is that these people have good reason to believe the relevant proposition P. They are justified ex ante in believing it, but they don't meet the appreciation condition. That's what Matt thinks is going on. Now, initially, the appreciation condition that Matt thought these people didn't meet was an appreciation condition that included ex ante justifications. But Matt, in the meantime, changed his mind. So Matt now thinks that a correct account of the appreciation condition has to be one where there's an actual grasping happening. So ex ante J is not going to be enough. So let me read it out to you. So on this appreciation condition that we're talking about, for some evidence E that you possess to justify in believing that P, or even give you a reason to believe P, you must meet some appreciation conditions such as knowing, justifiably believing that E supports P, grasping the support E provides to P, and so on and so forth. So you need to have some sort of cognitive grasp of this thing. And the reason for that, Matt explained to me, is that because he doesn't think that ex ante justification for believing is sufficient for appreciating the evidence. You have to actually grasp something or another. Now, I agree with Matt that for appreciating the evidence in an intuitive sense of appreciating, it may well be that ex ante justification is not enough. But the sense of the appreciation condition that we need for the epistemic support and the having relation, I think, is one that for which what we want is ex ante justification. So basically, I think that what we want is to say, whatever we want to say about whether a cognizer appreciates the evidence or not, I think that what we want to say is that what is needed for a cognizer to have the evidence. So that sort of appreciation condition, right? So the condition that the cognizer needs to meet in order to even be attuned to the fact, as it were, that evidence is evidence for P to begin with, that needs to be spelled in terms of an ex ante J condition. So I think that that's where we disagree. So basically, for me, and the reason why that is the case is because for me, the having relation is very important, that the having relation, the evidential support relation don't end up being disjoint. These two are not independent plausibly. So I want the view to predict that they're not independent, basically. So I guess what's important is that in order to see where the discussion lies is to notice that take, for instance, Professor Racist, or I don't know that it matters that it's Professor Racist, it probably doesn't. So the difference between Professor Racist and my 3-year-old, if they were to engage in the exact same sort of problematic behavior, for me, would be that my 3-year-old would remain justified in whatever he believes because he is not clever enough to grasp the evidential power of the evidence that lies right in front of Professor Racist, while Professor Racist is clever enough. So as it were, for me, to me, it seems as though the difference maker in this case is not whether my 3-year-old is grasping or whether Professor Racist is grasping, is whether they are able to grasp. And my 3-year-old is not, because he's not sophisticated enough, while the Professor Racist is. So that's, I think, where Matt and I disagree. What about the lungs analogy? So I know that Matt wanted to move quickly through this, but I'm very keen on my lungs analogy, so I'm going to go ahead and defend it in an unreasonable amount of time. So remember that Matt wondered whether I'm true, whether it's true what I'm saying, that lungs, the proper functioning of lungs is input dependent, in that you can't be a properly functioning lung if you are in an environment with easily available oxygen, but you're not taking it up. No matter how well you might process it, should it be delivered to you. Insofar as you're not taking it up, you're not properly functioning. That was the claim. And Matt wonders, is that really true? And rightfully so. The lungs needn't malfunction just because the diaphragm can't contract or because the trachea can't open and so on and so forth. And I say, yes, I should have been clearer. All of this kind of functionalist examples, they're always against the background of ceteris paribus or ceteris absentibus in terms of other malfunctions, basically. So the question is always, if everything else works well, are lungs who are not taking up oxygen from the environment malfunctioning? And the answer is yes. If everything else works just fine, but the lung is just not doing the thing, then there's a problem with the lung. And similarly, the thought is, if everything else is just fine, but your cognitive system just doesn't take up that information, that there's a laptop in front of you right now, there's a problem with your cognitive system. Now, as Matt well pointed out, whether we believe these things about lungs or not is less important. What's important is, of course, that it is perfectly compatible with what we know about, biological traits, that there be traits that are such that their proper function involves taking stuff up. And even if biological traits weren't like that, surely we can imagine a machinery that's like that. So I don't know, imagine the difference between a machine where you just put in the tomatoes and then it outputs tomato juice versus a machine that's a bit more sophisticated in that it has this, robotic arm that's supposed to take up tomatoes from a crate, but not bananas. Now we want to say that the second machinery malfunctions if it fails to take up the tomatoes in the easily available presence of tomatoes. It also malfunctions if it takes up bananas instead of tomatoes, and so on and so forth. And that's because the second machinery, but not the first, has an input-dependent proper function. So it's part of its proper functioning. What does that tell us? That tells us that it's not two separate functions with two separate proper functions in the way in which Matt was suggesting. Maybe that's what's going on. It tells us that the proper function itself includes all of the steps. So it's the taking up of the tomato and the squeezing it into a tomato juice or something like that. If you do only half of it, you haven't fulfilled any function. There's a proper functioning includes doing all of this stuff, all right? And what's important for our purposes here, since we're not talking about justified tomato uptake, is that empirical results do overwhelmingly confirm my hypothesis that the proper functioning of our cognitive system is input dependent, i.e. that our cognitive systems are malfunctioning if they fail to respond to environmental stimuli, including information. Right. And now, empirical results may be wrong, but notice, for a proper functionalist like me, it matters if empirical results predict this or not. Right. So I'm not going to bore you with the empirical bits here, but the thought is that neuroplasticity matters for proper function. And there are two types of neuroplasticity. The one that we care about here has to do with the brain's disposition for neural level changes in response to the environment. So they predict the brain's capacity to take up information from the environment, basically. So the thought is that it is quite widely agreed that when a cognitive system displays abnormally low levels of structural neuroplasticity, learning in response to novel stimuli from the environment fails to occur at the normal rate. So the brain is improperly functioning. And that usually tends to happen with age. The more we age, the more our neuroplasticity decreases, which may well, for all I know, explain increasing level of dogmatism with age, right? So conversely, of course, abnormally low levels of neuroplasticity generating low responses to environmental stimuli predict improper cognitive functioning. So if that's so, we have further reason to believe, insofar as our brains and our minds have something to do with each other, that the proper functioning of our cognitive system is input dependent, right? So that one way in which they can malfunction is by failing to respond to easily available environmental stimuli. Moving on, since I'm sure Matt is quite surprised by now how big a deal I made out of that lungs objection. So Matt worried about whether my view, even though I'm trying to limit the stuff that I'm in a position to know, whether my view isn't still over-generating stuff that I'm in a position to know and thereby over-generating epistemic obligation. And I want to say that it does not. And here is why. I do think that it has probably to do with moving maybe a bit too swiftly between the common sense notion of being in a position to know and the technical one that I'm using. Because in common sense parlance, we don't distinguish very neatly between being in a position to know and being in a position to come to know. It is perfectly okay for me to say that I'm in a position to know what Chris is doing right now because I can just go ahead and call him. While on my view, that's being in a position to come to know. Right. And the reason why I introduced that absolutely technical thing is in order to make this distinction between what I'm in a position to know by just forming the belief and what I still need to do some stuff in order to come to be in that position. Right. And this is an important distinction for me because it protects me from this overgeneration. Why is that? Now, of course, at intuitive level, you want to say I'm in a position to know what's at the end of my, at the extreme of my visual field right now, but not on what I mean by being in a position to know, because we are cognitively limited people. We're only able to take up, say, I don't know, let's say 20 things that are happening in our visual field. On my view, those are the only things that I'm in a position to know. Those 20 that are part of the set that is quantitatively as large as I can take up, basically, right? So the subset of all the things that are happening around me, the subset of 20 is the only kind of subset of things that I'm in a position to know on the view that I have. All the other things in my visual field may be intuitively on a folk notion in such that I'm in a position to know them, but not on my view. On my view, they're in a position to come to know because I need to do more stuff. I need to switch my attention from this set of 20 to a different set of 20. I need to move my head, my eyes, and so on and so forth. So basically, the way in which the view is built is analytically impossible for me to have the overgeneration problem, in that this ought implies can is built into the view. If I can't take up more than 20, then I'm not in a position to know more than this 20. The other ones are things that I'm not in a position to know. I'm just in a position to come to know. So I think that it's analytically impossible for my view to have this over-demandingness problem. And you can see that for the Chrysler building example as well. So Matt worries, well, really, I mean, is it really the case that it works in the way in which Mona wants it to work, that while you're counting the windows, you're not really in a position to know all of these green hats that are walking past you? It seems as though it's quite hard, actually, to keep your attention focused on counting. All of this green hat information seems to come over you, as it were. One has to try hard, Matt says, because otherwise one cannot count anymore because distracted by the green hats. And he takes that to be evidence that maybe it's quite counterintuitive to say that you're not in a position to know this green hat information, given that you can barely keep your eyes on the counting because of it. Well, what I want to say is that the story that Matt tells us suggests that the Windows data and the station data, so the green hat data, together form a set that's too large for the quantitative limitations that I have. And that explains why I'm trying so hard to keep my attention on the windows, because as soon as I start forming beliefs about green hats, I can't form beliefs about the windows anymore. So what my views say about this case is that I'm focusing on these 20 things that I can do, counting the windows. And the reason why I'm trying really hard to focus on them is because as soon as I form a belief about a green hat, that belief about the green hat is going to have to displace one other from this 20 set, basically. Now, all of this doesn't explain the zoning out objection. And this is, I think, a conversation that Matt and I had over dinner for a long time, and we ended up not really agreeing. I just don't think that's possible, the zoning out case. Of course, it's, possible somewhere in the modal space, but since this is a proper functionalist view, what matters is whether our brains are designed to do this, and more importantly, our properly functioning minds, right? So we've seen already that our brains are supposed to respond to stimuli, so properly functioning brains are stimuli responsive, and they're malfunctioning if they're not responsive. So this seems to suggest that by light of these people who work on neuroscience, I guess, a healthy brain cannot fully zone out, short of, basically closing shops or sleeping or something like that. And what that matters for me because I'm a proper functionalist. So what matters is for people like us, is it proper function or not to zone out? What I want to say is that what we usually call zone out is just I stop focusing on my book symposium and I start thinking about what I'm going to have for dinner or something like that. That's perfectly possible. I replace the 20 facts that are lying right in front of me with 20 facts that are happening in my mind and have to do with what I'm going to eat for dinner. That's perfectly fine. But not engaging in those 20 facts that I'm able to engage in, I want to say, is not possible for a properly functioning brain, and it's predicted empirically. And I want to dig in these hills. Now, I should say that I do have a bit of ADHD, so I remember laughing with Matt that maybe the fact that I'm such a strong believer in this claim has to do with the fact that I can't do it because of my ADHD, but it is what it is. Are other creatures who can zone out possible? Of course they are. But if that's the case, then their proper function facts will differ. So then my account will get it right in their case as well. And just to finish up, remember that Matt ended up by proposing a view that he thought was not very far away from the way in which I think about things, but that he thought was kind of not having these vulnerabilities that he took my view to have, in virtue of the fact that it doesn't like my notion of being in a position to know. Now, I should say that for those like Matt who don't like my notion of being in a position to know, we don't need it. At the end of the day, it's an intermediate notion, right? So that is, being in a position to know is just a name for having a cognitive capacity with the function of generating knowledge that can take up the relevant fact. So we can call that something else if people don't like, how the technical notion relates to the everyday notion. And I predict that we're not going to have any overgeneration problems. But here's Matt's view, the alternative view that he proposes, and I'm happy to hear that he's writing a book on this. This is very exciting. The book, I gather, is provisionally called Should Believe, an essay in normative epistemology, just to advertise it a little. So on Matt's view, the thought is that when our cognitive system is engaged on a question, either by having an opinion on it already or by inquiring into it, then one is on the hook for following one's evidence on that question, so long as one is well positioned to do so. So the point is, you either believe something already or you're looking into this, and that makes you engaged on a question. And if you're engaged on that question, then as soon as you have some evidence against your belief or against whatever your position is in your inquiry, then you should follow up. So I don't know how this works. I mean, I'm quite curious to see. So here's where the worry for me lies. It seems to me as though whether you're engaged in a question or not is completely indifferent to normative defeat, basically. So take two climate change deniers. One of them is really interested, watches all the news and so on and so forth, but then decides at some point to stop watching, to stop reading The Guardian because they don't like what they hear in The Guardian, right? So because The Guardian keeps saying that climate is changing. So because they like to think that climate is not changing, they stop reading The Guardian. Now, this is someone who's engaged in inquiry, who's asking this question, cares about whether climate change is happening, but is not inquiring where they should. It's ignoring sources because they like to pretend that those sources don't exist because they don't like their answers, right? So that's a person who's not justified. But here's another person. This person just doesn't care about climate change at all. And I think that this is, I'm wondering actually if this is not a case that Julia gave me at some point, where this is someone who, as soon as there's something about climate change on TV, they change the channel because they don't care about the topic at all. Now, say that they do form a belief that climate change is not happening. Now, is it really intuitive to think that this is a person who's engaged on this question? To me, it doesn't seem intuitive in any sense. It does also seem that their belief that climate change is not happening is unjustified. So it seems to me as though whether you're engaged on the question or not is completely irrelevant. Now, of course, Matt might say what I said. Well, being engaged on a question, in my sense, is a technical notion that, as I told you already, is a disjunctive notion. It relates to either inquiring into it or already having a belief about it. So if that's the case, what I want to say is, well, then it seems as though Matt's mass new view is going to have the same terminological issue in that, being engaged on a question is not very intuitively the case when you just have a belief, but you never wonder about it. And also, it also seems as though you get this kind of disjunctive strange view where if you either believe it or you're wondering about it, then you need to follow up. So my thinking is, if, in terms of theoretical virtues, the worry is basically that what unifies these two things is a technical term, and that short of the technical term, we're ending up with a disjunctive view. So yeah, that's from me.
Okay, thank you, Mona. This concludes our session for today. I want to again thank everyone involved for participating and for taking time out of your busy days. I learned a lot. I thought the comments were very interesting and thoughtful, and it was nice to learn much more about Mona's book. And yes, thank you very much for all the hard work.